How can sorrow, which darkens the mind, become the very force that awakens it? We often assume that pain clouds understanding, that sadness obstructs clear thinking. In contemporary culture, emotional pain is treated as a malfunction to be fixed rather than a signal to be interpreted. Yet Yunus Emre, the 13th century Sufi poet and thinker, proposed the opposite. He taught that a tear shed in remembrance of truth is not an expression of despair, but an act of transformation. In psychological language, pain reorganizes perception. It breaks habitual attention patterns and forces the mind to question its assumptions. A tear then becomes an epistemic event, a moment when the self's rigid framework of understanding softens enough to perceive what it previously ignored. Emre's statement that a tear becomes light is not poetic exaggeration. It describes a process of purification. Sorrow, when understood, can transmute into awareness. The guiding question of this exploration is simple yet profound. What psychological and metaphysical mechanism allows sorrow to become illumination? Modern psychology and neuroscience confirm what Emre implied centuries ago. Emotions are not distractions from knowledge, but integral to it. Yet our culture has developed an allergy to sadness. The dominant ideal is the constantly optimized, high-functioning self, always positive, productive, and composed. Emotional distress is often pathologized, medicated, or distracted away. This avoidance has consequences. When we suppress sadness, we also suppress the brain's natural mechanism for self-correction. Neuroscience identifies a key system called the salience network, which detects mismatches between our beliefs and lived experience. When emotional pain arises, it is signaling that something in our mental model no longer aligns with reality. Avoiding that signal prevents psychological integration. Over time, this leads to what clinical research calls emotional incoherence. When one's cognitive understanding and emotional experience diverge, the person appears stable but internally fragmented. Yunus Emre's insight anticipates this by centuries. In his view, resisting pain freezes the soul. Facing it refines perception. Emotional suffering, properly understood, is a teacher, not a flaw. The question is how to engage it consciously rather than defensively. Yunus Emre lived in 13th century Anatolia, an era of social upheaval and religious complexity. A student of Taptok Emre, he became one of the clearest voices of experiential spirituality. Unlike metaphysical philosophers, Emre did not analyze reality through abstract speculation. He explored it through the laboratory of the heart. For Emre, emotion itself was a form of cognition. He saw tears not as weakness, but as evidence of awakening. A tear, in his poetry, symbolizes the precise moment the heart perceives its distance from truth. The instant illusion collapses. In Sufi thought, the heart is not a metaphor for feeling. It is a faculty of perception. When Emre says that a tear becomes light, he is describing a cognitive transformation. Emotion becomes recognition. Recognition dissolves illusion. Illusion dissolves into light. His method is a discipline of sincerity, a systematic removal of inner distortion, so that perception becomes transparent. In psychological terms, it is emotional integration as a path to knowledge. The first stage of Emre's method begins where most people want to end, with pain. In Sufi epistemology, ignorance is not a lack of information but attachment to false identification, the belief that the constructed self is ultimate. Pain disrupts this attachment by exposing contradiction between how we imagine reality and how it actually is. Cognitive science describes a similar mechanism called prediction error. The brain continually predicts what will happen next based on internal models. When reality violates these predictions, the resulting discomfort forces the system to update itself. Emotional pain, then, is not meaningless suffering, but a neural message that our worldview is incomplete. EMRE spiritualizes this insight. The tear is what occurs when the self perceives its own inadequacy, the moment illusion fails to sustain itself. If this recognition is resisted, suffering intensifies. If it is allowed, it becomes transformation. Thus, pain functions as perception correcting itself. Rather than punishment, it is the first signal of awakening. Emotional disintegration, when met consciously, becomes the doorway to deeper coherence. The second element in Emre's method is sincerity, what he calls the Samimi G and L, the sincere heart. For Emre, sincerity is not moral performance. It is the removal of internal distortion. The sincere heart is one in which emotion and awareness align. In psychological language, this is emotional transparency, the state in which affective signals are neither suppressed nor exaggerated, but allowed to register accurately. Research in affective neuroscience shows that authenticity correlates with limbic prefrontal coherence, a balanced interaction between emotional centers and cognitive control regions. When emotions are acknowledged rather than fought, the nervous system restores equilibrium. Emre intuited this dynamic long before neuroscience. He claimed that when emotion is held consciously, without denial or indulgence, it becomes luminous. The tear for him marks the instant emotion transforms from reactivity into clarity. He writes, "One tear shed in remembrance is worth a lifetime of dry reason." The meaning is rational. Knowledge detached from emotion becomes sterile. Emotion integrated with awareness becomes understanding. The practical implication is clear. Emotional honesty is not a vulnerability, but a cognitive discipline. Emre's third principle concerns the faculty through which transformation occurs. The heart.sufi philosophy distinguishes between knowing by intellect and knowing by being. The intellect analyses, the heart perceives. It is dynamic, receptive, and capable of direct insight. Modern neuroscience provides an unexpected parallel. The interoceptive network, spanning the insula, anterior cingulate, and brainstem, processes signals from the body that inform emotional awareness and moral judgment. When these signals are consciously integrated, individuals report a greater sense of clarity and meaning. Emre's teaching mirrors this. He says, "What the eye cannot see, the heart perceives." The heart's seeing is not sensory, but existential. It knows by resonance rather than representation. From a cognitive perspective, emotional integration reorganizes neural connectivity, creating higher-order coherence across brain regions. What was once noise becomes pattern. What was confusion becomes insight. Emre's philosophical conclusion follows: intellect organizes, but only the heart interprets. Both are essential, but only the heart transforms data into meaning. This raises a striking question. Is wisdom simply emotion that has become lucid? Here we reach the philosophical core of Emre's insight, the paradox that darkness itself produces illumination. Ordinary logic treats opposites as mutually exclusive. Suffering negates happiness, ignorance negates understanding. Emre collapses this duality. For him, suffering is not the opposite of light, but its condition. Pain dismantles the illusion of autonomy. It exposes dependence, fragility, and the constructed nature of the ego. In that exposure, space opens for the real, for the dimension of being that was previously concealed by self-certainty. Cognitive science offers a compelling analogy. Only when a mental model fails does metacognition, thinking about thinking, emerge. Likewise, spiritual insight begins when the self's model of reality collapses. Psychological studies of post-traumatic growth show that individuals who experience deep suffering often later report heightened meaning, empathy, and spiritual awareness. For Emre, this is not random resilience, but the natural law of consciousness. When the false breaks, the true becomes visible. Therefore, light does not come after the tear. The tear is the process of becoming light. The instant awareness recognizes itself through the experience of loss. From this view, the deepest pain is not merely emotional. It is consciousness realizing its own depth. How can Emre's method be applied today? His framework aligns closely with modern approaches to emotional intelligence and mindfulness-based therapy. Before reacting, observe the emotion as an event in awareness. Neuroscience shows that this activates the medial prefrontal cortex, which integrates emotional and cognitive information. Observation begins to decouple experience from identification. Then, name and accept. Label the emotion precisely: sadness, grief, fear. Studies at UCLA demonstrate that affect labeling reduces amygdala hyperactivity and restores clarity. Acceptance stabilizes attention. Next, reflect on meaning. Rather than asking why do I feel bad, ask what truth is this emotion revealing. This shifts processing from rumination to insight, converting affect into cognitive information. Finally, release ownership. Do not personalize emotion. Recognize it as a message, not an identity. This mirrors the Sufi principle of taslub, surrender. When the emotion is allowed to complete its course without possession, it resolves naturally. Through these steps, emotional disturbance transforms into illumination. Pain becomes information. Information becomes understanding. Applied to modern contexts, grief, stress, burnout, or existential confusion, this method reframes suffering as a mechanism of growth. It turns reactivity into awareness and chaos into comprehension. From a rational standpoint, consciously processed emotion becomes a catalyst for both psychological evolution and spiritual realization. To suffer consciously is to learn truth directly. The tear that becomes light is not a mystical metaphor, but a precise description of human cognition and consciousness. Sorrow disrupts illusion. Sincerity purifies perception. The heart then perceives reality directly, and awareness becomes coherent, luminous. In Emre's language, modern neuroscience supports this trajectory. When emotional and cognitive networks synchronize, the brain exhibits greater gamma coherence, a pattern associated with insight, compassion, and unity of experience. The mind literally becomes more integrated, reflecting the same harmony that Emre described as divine light. For Emre, enlightenment is not an escape from emotion, but its integration into knowledge. The spiritual and the psychological are not separate domains, but two vocabularies for the same process. The refinement of perception in this light. The tear is both symbol and mechanism. The transformation of emotional energy into clarity. Perhaps wisdom is not born in calm, but in the moment of trembling, when consciousness confronts its limits and becomes transparent enough for truth to shine through. That is Yunus Emre's hidden method. To allow the tear to become light, to let the very act of feeling reveal the nature of knowing.